Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. Please share your thoughts and ideas at https://bit.ly/extension calling evaluation. That's https://bit.ly/extension calling evaluation, or rank us on your podcast app. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, mail.wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening. The episode we are playing today was first aired shortly after the outbreak of E. coli contamination in leafy greens back in 2018. Right now is a great time to talk about food safety because for most of our vegetable producers, they haven't yet put anything in the ground, and so they have some downtime before they start their seeds and really get into the planting and harvesting stage of the summer. So please take some time, listen to this episode, and take some steps towards improving the food safety on your farm. And the reason this becomes an issue is because when you have a huge farm that's growing thousands of heads of lettuce, they all get packaged and washed, and if there's a little tiny bit of E. coli bacteria on it from say you're harvesting from your home garden, a little bit of E. coli on your home lettuce or from a local farm, it's going to be there. We cannot completely remove the risk of it being there, regardless of how much sanitation and everything we do. And we eat it relatively quickly, however, so it's not a big issue. But when it's getting put on a truck and shipped across the country, those bacterium have the ability to reproduce and grow and grow and grow. So in optimal growth conditions, most bacteria double every 20 minutes. So it's exponential growth. So say we have one bacterium at 0 minutes, one little teeny tiny, all by itself bacterium. Within 20 minutes, you have 2. In 40 minutes, you have 4. In 60 minutes, you have 8. In 12 hours, you have 1 trillion. So let that sink in for a minute. It is mostly the time frame between harvest and consumption that causes the danger. And because most of our greens are shipped across the country to our kitchens, that is why the Food Safety Management Act was put into play. Food Safety Management is also called FSMA, the FSMA, and it actually provides a legal foundation for the U.S. government to mandate food safety practices.
Going a little bit more into this handling chain, if we think about who's responsible for ensuring the food ensuring safety in the produce, you have to think of who handles the produce. And it goes all the way from the fields that it's harvested. So, the farmers, they grow, they harvest, they handle, they pack, and they pack it, and then it goes to distributors where they store, they handle, they transport the produce. Retailers and restaurants then store, handle again, prepare the produce, and we as consumers consume it, but we also have a hand in preparing, consuming the produce that we buy. And contamination can happen at any of these levels. And what Karen was saying was right. This 20 minutes for one bacterium to reproduce, if you're already starting with a few hundred, it doesn't take long to get to the numbers that can make you really sick. So it's true that early on in the chain will give you a higher risk for contamination if something is present, but it can happen just as quickly in the consumer side. Let's say we leave something overnight, or you're cutting your your pork products, let's say, with one knife, and then you're making a nice dish, so you start cutting the lettuce as well. Well, then you could potentially have some kind of outbreak if you're working with poultry salmonella, or if you're working with meat, you can have E. coli, just depending on the situation there as well. But yeah, the time frame is really, really short for that.
Yeah, and another thing to think about is the most common route of contamination is your hands. It's the hands of the workers who harvest the food. It's the hands of the workers who pack the food. It's the hands of the workers who prepare the food. So a good hand washing regime will go a long way towards making sure that your food is safe. And one of the questions that we get asked is, well, I wash all my vegetables, so I should be okay, right? Well, lettuce has a lot of very small pores where these bacterium can hide. And while you definitely should be washing your produce, you also need to recognize that it'll only get some of the bacterium off. So if you have, 100,000 colony counts, then you wash it, well, you're still going to have enough left to make you sick. So while you will get some off, you're not going to get enough off so that it won't make you sick. So if you know that the produce has been contaminated, you cannot wash it to get it clean. When we process it, when a food producer processes their lettuces, they typically run through a wash cycle with a sanitization agent with the goal of getting anything that was on it off, or at least down to a minimal count, so because it is going to go in that truck and be transported and have that time to reproduce. So the main focus of utilizing a food safety protocol is to help reduce the initial counts. So to reduce the opportunity for a bacterial exposure to occur and get into the food system. So there's two things. There's GAP, which is Good Agricultural Practices, and that is a voluntary third-party certification system that is buyer-driven. So basically, that means the grocery store says to its growers, I need you to make sure you have a food safety plan, and you need to have this certification which proves that you are following your food safety plan. Then there is FSMA, or the Food Safety Management Act. That is a law. And so if you are producing more than $25,000 worth of produce, then you are subject to this law, and you must follow certain aspects of it. Now, the bigger the larger the farm, means the more produce they have, means the more stringent a law they have to follow. So it is a little bit more leeway for the smaller growers, but just because you're a small farm and you're not a huge multinational with a workforce of 400, it doesn't mean that you are not subject to this law. So you really need to learn what is it that you have to do to keep your produce safe for your consumers.
Yeah, and that's true. And a lot of our local farmers markets, produce auctions as well. In the Ohio side, at least, we do provide a 3-hour food safety training class that's required by the auction house, which is and this is where we do go over the sanitation practices, keeping things clean, handling all the steps that we alluded to earlier that can have a contamination step in there. There is a certification that the people growing the food do have this certification. What Karen was saying about and there's different levels of it as well. And there are certain laws depending on how big the farm is, but there's also an insurance or a liability that's actually kind of, taken on by a retailer that's buying produce and selling, which will typically require a higher standard of food safety education and to include inspections as well by USDA, and I want to say private inspectors that are licensed from the USDA that have the proper licensure for that kind of inspection. But And one point I wanted to make, we talked about the different chains and the different ways that contamination can happen. Things like we hear a lot about tomatoes and lettuce causing E. coli outbreaks, and some of the reasons why that is so is because a lot of these things are consumed raw. The cooking step is typically a great way to kill a lot of bacterium that could potentially be there. So at some level, it's just obvious that there's a higher risk in consuming raw products versus cooked products. So let that kind of be your guide of whether, if you suspect something, maybe think about how you're going to prepare it if you do suspect it and you are willing to take on that risk. At a certain level of contamination, however, the best advice is just to get rid of the produce so that you're not even setting yourself up for any kind of exposure. But the way we prepare food at the end of that chain also kind of affects how possibly the pathogen can get into our bodies and make us sick.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because the Food Safety Management Act Produce Safety Rule is specifically for products that are typically consumed raw. And those are actually considered highly dangerous foods because they do not have that kill step. So if you're coming at it from a food safety standpoint in a kitchen, you should actually be looking at your lettuce as being a more dangerous thing than your chicken. And so when you're working with your products, do make sure that you are keeping them separate, separate cutting board, separate knife, have one specifically for meats and one for produce, and that'll go a long way in your kitchen itself. But when you're working in a commercial environment, in a kitchen, in a restaurant, again, you want to keep your produce in a completely separate area of the kitchen. Now, so let's go back to the farm, though, because that's our area of expertise. So when you're working on the farm, that's you're in stage one. You are the beginning of the chain. So we try really hard to make sure that everything we're doing is preventing exposure of our plants to things like E. coli and salmonella or whatever. The neat thing about E. coli is that it's killed by sunlight. And so if you're in the wild and, say a deer poops on the lettuce, then the rain washes it off and then it sits in the sun for a while, the parts of the leaf that were exposed to the sun will not have the E. coli. However, the leaf has two sides, and there's that little pit down in the center. So it always has an opportunity for maintaining those bacterial culture areas. So there are things in nature to help reduce our exposure, but we really need to make that first step of if we see deer poop that we do not harvest anywhere near that area, because we know if we see one little lump that there's some more somewhere else nearby, because that's deer for you.
Right, and that is actually one form of a risk that could potentially be there at the production stage. So livestock and wildlife, we talked a little bit about that. There's also things like surface water, irrigation practices, sewage, and our own hands. We are handling this stuff, and again, if we have certain practices that we utilize, mainly hand washing, to make sure that we do it at the proper times before we handle the vegetables, it can go a long way in terms of that initial exposure. But yeah, that is true. So if you see wildlife kind of eat like maybe mingling around a certain area of the farm over where the produce were, or even if they're eating there, they're going to be pooping there too. It just kind of works out that way usually. And but if you see that, just kind of take note of that. Figure out a good radius that you are comfortable with in terms of avoiding that potential contamination at the start, and then there's gonna be a loss there, but at least you will do your step into ensuring food safety for the next consumer, which could very well be yourself at home, and potentially how you're going to prepare something that's closer to that contamination versus away from it. That's also something to think about. So other hazards that we can talk about. Other hazards can be found just by looking at an aerial map of your farm. You talked about this food safety plan. The start of any food safety plan is to identify any hazards that are within the produce area. So we talked about deer. Well, having a tree line close to where you're growing the produce is a potential hazard because the deer will come out and feed and go back in their homes. Things like creeks that are close by. Again, woods with wildlife. Maybe a farm that's adjacent, a farm as in row crops. We start thinking about potential pesticide damage, also nutrient management, different types of crops such as apple trees versus produce. You're going to spray different things. You're going to treat them a little bit different. Things that are growing typically closer to the ground possibly have a higher rate of contamination than something that's growing a bit higher. And, if we think about, poop falls with gravity. So it'd be difficult to have E. coli contamination, let's say, on an apple tree if it's picked from the tree itself. But there are birds. So that's something else to consider.
All right. So Dan has touched on a lot of really important aspects. And the first thing is, yes, you do need to have a map of your farm. That should be the first step of any type of farming operation, regardless of whether or not you're doing produce production. Having a map of the farm, knowing where the roads go, where your entrances and exits are, where your fences are, where your water outlets are, where your tools are kept, where your pesticides are kept. All of those things, having a map is your first step to not only having a food safety plan, but to having a farm safety plan. You really need to know and be able to show, say, an emergency worker, okay, this is where the grain bin is, and this is where the pesticides are kept. They need to have access to that information. And that is your first step for biosecurity on the farm, knowing your entrances and exits, where you need to have a wash station to clean your tires, and also to know, okay, so here's your compost bin over here where you have your manure composting. Oh, but you drive through it to get to your lettuce field. Well, you're going to be picking that up on the tires of the vehicle and transporting it into the lettuce field. And there was actually an outbreak associated with that exact happening. So having a map and laying out where things are will definitely be your first step towards having a better farm safety plan.
And on that, it's not necessarily that you're driving over the compost, but even runoff from the compost itself. Think about that. If you have, obviously, compost is fresh waste, whether it's plant-based, animal-based, whatever, and it composts itself for safety. It heats up. You have to turn it, and then there's different ways to make compost, but there's always going to be that water runoff. So unless that's controlled, that's a source of contamination. So if that's running down into the road that you're driving through, you might not even realize it, but you're running through the compost and then further infecting downrange of that.
That's right. I mean, you think of water as the universal solvent. It is going to pick it up wherever it goes. So if your water source is downhill from your manure pile and you're using that water source to irrigate your vegetable crops, there needs to be some adjustments made to your farm plan. And, one of the things that a lot of people who have enacted a food safety plan have found is that after they went through the process of building, even if they didn't go through with a GAP certification program, once they have gone through the class and then they've gone through the food safety manual and gotten it set up for their farm, they've found inefficiencies in their farm that they've been able to get rid of. They found products that weren't selling, that they were wasting, and they were able to improve the value of the products they were producing, and they were able to make sure that they were wasting less money on the farm. So they found a lot of inconsistencies in their actions, and they also found better ways to be more efficient. So, it's really great that they have not only been able to expand their market by being GAP certified, but they've also been able to improve their on-farm efficiency just by trying to improve their food safety. So it is a really good thing to go through and look at how you do things on the farm, where you do things on the farm, and what kind of inputs you're using.
Yeah, that's right. And so let's go ahead and talk about one of those possible contaminants, such as water. We're going to kind of break down a few of the different ways that you can possibly contamination, but we'll start with water. So human pathogen and pests associated with water, on-farm use, water, factors that influence the produce contaminated by water, all that stuff. But one thing that we have to understand is that all these things, the bacteria, the viruses, the protists, the things like water molds, fungi, bacteria, all this stuff it needs water to survive. And that's why I think we didn't talk about it, but doing things like the curing step and drying step is another way to kind of kill a lot of pathogens. But in terms of if we do have a farm plan and we're looking at different possible risks that we're taking with irrigation, let's say, you need to understand that surface water is probably the highest source of contamination. And what Karen was saying was right. Water always flows downhill. So if you have, let's go back to that livestock example. If you have a barn or livestock that's uphill from surface water, well, there's a potential for contamination there into the pond and the surface water that you're using. What are you using that water for? Are you cleaning the vegetables? Are you irrigating? Overhead irrigation versus drip irrigation are going to be different risks. But in terms of the highest risk would be surface water. Groundwater is underground.
Before we move on to groundwater, I just want to say if you collect water in rain barrels, that counts as surface water because it runs over an open surface before it's collected. Also, if you have a spring that runs into a cistern but it is exposed to the atmosphere before it goes into your cistern, meaning it runs over the ground, then it is also considered surface water. If you have an enclosed spring that is pulled, that never touches the ground into it before it gets into its cistern, then that is counted as groundwater, as is your well. And then, of course, there's municipal water or city water, which is the stuff that you get out of the tap. Now, I do want to go back to if you are using surface water, you should not ever be washing your produce with surface water because it does have a high potential for contamination unless you are specifically treating that water and monitoring the chlorination levels of the water while you are washing. You should never use surface water to clean produce. You should only use municipal water or something that has been through a sanitization process.
Yep. And all right, here's a scenario for you. Okay, you are doing drip irrigation. You are avoiding surface water. So you've tested your groundwater for possible contaminants that has passed. You put that in your records. You're using that water to irrigate, and you're ensuring that the water you're using is clean. Now, let's say you want to mix some pesticides in there or a fungicide in there. And where are you getting that water from? Are you getting it from the surface water? Because if you are, and then you're mixing these pesticide products, whether it be a fungicide or an insecticide, or if we're working with produce, probably not an herbicide. But do you see the potential there? In terms of it's a step that you might not realize is really irrigating with contaminated water. So, just be very attentive on what you're doing. And if it's something that's kind of out of place or something you don't do very often, it could still be a major point of contamination.
Yeah, that's right. Anytime you're using, and plus also your surface water is going to have varying pH levels, which is going to affect the effectiveness of your pesticides. So you want to make sure that you know the water that you're using and that it has been tested. If you fall under the FSMA rules, you do have to test any water that is used on the farm for irrigation, for pesticide use, or anything else. Pesticide sprays should typically use the potable water, as well as all drinking water should be potable, and hand washing water should be potable. If you are using surface water, you should be using drip irrigation. If you're using overhead irrigation with surface water, then you need to have a rest period between your last watering and harvest in order for it to not be considered a contaminated food product going into the market.
And then let's say there's a flood and the water rises. Well, flood water is obviously very high risk because it's not only surface water, but it's full of contaminants like sewage, animal waste, pathogens, chemicals, toxins, possibly even heavy metals. If it comes from the river, and there's obviously some kind of contamination due to the factories upstream, it's extremely risky. And with floodwater, if any floodwater touches your produce, you discard it. And I remember, earlier on the show, we were talking about something like apples. if floodwaters don't necessarily touch your produce, it's still a risk. But, and that's something you need to assess. But if any floodwater comes in contact with your produce, then that should be discarded immediately.
Yeah, there is no way you can come back from that. It is automatically considered an adulterated food source and thus illegal to enter our food chain. And after you have discarded it, or as you are discarding it, you need to quantify exactly what you're discarding and then contact the local FSA office to see if there is some funding to help replenish your loss. And crop insurance is another thing you could do for that, but we'll talk about that another day because we are out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Karen Cox with WVU Extension in Ohio County.
And this is Dan Lima with OSU Extension in Belmont County. And Karen, go ahead and give your number so if people want to take the class, they can contact you.
That's right. And my phone number is 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.